You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is Brian McClanahan, your host, and this is episode 44, covering the week of September 26th to September 30th, 2016. Glad to have you back on the program. We had a really interesting week at the Institute this week, at least the material we had, which was under a common theme, which I'll talk about here in just a minute, I think really exemplified some of the problems that we're seeing in American political discourse today. Without a doubt, when you look at the 2016 presidential election, it's apparent that there is a fundamental problem in America with how we view politics and what we're out to, quote-unquote, conserve in American society. And I think the root of all that problem is the Republican Party. But I'll get to that in a minute. First, I'd like to talk about one thing. If you are liking this podcast, if you enjoy it, if you like our website, if you think the material we put up there is top-notch and you want to see more of it, well, please, 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 make a donation to the Abbeville Institute. Go to abbevilleinstitute.org. Up at the top, there's a support tab. You click down to that, and you find memberships for individuals, and you click on that, and you can make a donation. We're coming up at the end of the year. We've got about 3 months left. We are a nonprofit organization, so any donation you make is tax deductible to the full extent of the law, so please consider that. Help us keep the podcast going. Help us keep the website going. Help us have our programs. You know, we have some great ideas for next year. We actually have some other interesting projects for next year we'd like to do, but we do exist on your generous contributions alone. So whatever you can do for us, it's well appreciated, and we'll put it to good use. Also, like us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. All these podcasts do go up on YouTube. We will have some new audio files going up shortly from our summer school and from our conference on nullification. So they will be up. And shortly thereafter, we'll have the videos available for that too. So you can go on YouTube. They will show up on YouTube. And we're hopefully going to be using our YouTube channel a little more frequently here in 2017 with some really great projects. So look for that in the future. Okay, now, on to our material for the week. And I said the root of all the problem that we're facing is the Republican Party. It's not the Democratic Party. It's the Republican Party. And if you look at the history of the Republican Party, I think it's very clear. It's the same party that was there in when it was founded. And it's the same party. It's the same party that was around the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and 80s. Really not much has changed. It is in some ways, anti-Southern party. I know a lot of Southerners are in the Republican Party now, and of course the stronghold for the Republican Party is the South. But we're doing this at our own peril and believing in the Republican Party. And I think every single piece this week speaks to that. Now, you could say that, well, the Republican Party today is different. We've had a shift in the parties. No, really all that's happened is the Democratic Party changed. It moved to a progressive party. The Republican Party has always been fairly progressive and nationalistic. The Democratic Party had long been interested in federalism, states' rights. And that changed really about the middle of the 20th century. But I think you saw it changing around 1896, really the last gasp for the Democrats in being conservative and interested in a much more traditionally Democratic stance on states' rights, federalism, these type of things, was in 1904 when the Democrats nominated Alton Parker. But after that, I mean, the Democratic Party has moved, and that's really what happened. The Democratic Party left the South. And I know that, of course, we had Franklin Roosevelt, who's very popular in the South, and Harry Truman was somewhat popular in the South. And even up in the 1950s, Adlai Stevenson was picking up the South. But in 1964, you had a transformational election where Republicans snatched the South from the Democrats. And that was Barry Goldwater. Of course, the first time you started seeing the Republican Party have somewhat of a Southern strategy was in 1896 with William McKinley. But then moving forward, we had the Democrats still fairly solidly controlling the South up until 1964. And then, of course, you had Richard Nixon win in 1972 with his solid South strategy. And then moving forward, the Republicans have picked up the South. This is unfortunate because the Republican Party has never really been interested in the traditional South or what the South has long brought to the United States. And the South really is the bedrock of American conservatism. It is the foundation of it. And so every piece we had this week was on this particular idea. So the first piece, no Confederacy, no Republicans, but a pale horse. And it was written by Paul Yarborough, and he has written for us a lot here recently. And he starts by saying the Republican Party is no more Republican than the Democratic Party is Democratic. Both are oligarchies promoting their namesakes as if those in charge, power, have the interests of the people firmly in their hearts. But he says they're both corrupt. Though the Democrats have taken fraud and debasement to levels down not seen since Thaddeus Stevens et al. I would actually say since James Blaine of Maine. He was the last really, I mean, you look at that Gilded Age Republican Party, and it was very, very corrupt. So he says, so they, the Republicans, proclaim they are the conservatives and the Democrats are the liberals. Horse dung, neither is either. However, the affectation about vernacular, old, honest Abe, is not going to be dispelled anytime soon as long as pseudo-historians like Bill O'Reilly, Rich Lowry, et al. Can find a publisher. Of course, what's happening here is the Republican Party has tapped into this old conservative element in the South. States' rights, federalism, limited government, light taxes, all these things that are culturally based in the South. Whether you're looking at Cavalier culture, Celtic culture, whatever it is, you're looking at old, long-standing cultural traits that have affected the South for hundreds of years. And so the Republican Party rhetorically has capitalized that on that recently. Though the Republican Party has never really been supportive of real federalism. The question becomes, what are we trying to conserve? And the last piece of the week is going to get into that, but what are we trying to conserve? And he says at the end of this piece, Democrats equals mob rule, Republicans equals full rule, final score oligarchs to Republic 0. And behold a pale horse. So what he's saying is that it doesn't matter which Republican is in power, which Republican Southerners vote for. The South is still going to lose. Ultimately, the South will lose. The traditional South will lose in this game. And they will. National politics is really not the place to be looking for solutions to our long-standing problems. They have to be found at the state and local level. And even further down than that, in the household, in your community. So local politics, great. State politics, good. National politics, if there is such a thing. There isn't really a national polity anyways in America, but if there is a national polity, I mean, we're never going to have anything succeed that way. Even if Donald Trump wins, it'll be a blip, as he's even said. It'll be a short arrest of the headlong plunge into national socialism that the Republican Party has been very much for as well. You see it all the time. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are nationalistic. They're nationalists. And they support a national agenda. The 50 plus 1%. Now, Yarborough says Democrats are mob rule, Republicans full rule. They're both mob rule at the end of the day. It's both 50 plus 1%. And they have a national program, and they think the national government, the central government, or the general government, better terms, are the ones who can solve every problem in America. We know this is not true, but this is the case. And so we're looking at 2016, and people are saying, gosh, this is it. If we lose, we're done. Well, I mean, I could say we've been done for a long time, for over 100 years. The situation we're confronted with is how do we arrest this problem? How do we stop the problem? Well, it has to be from the bottom up, from state and local solutions, not national solutions. It's not going to happen. And Southerners really need to start reconsidering their support for the Republican Party. You might say, well, okay, we can support it at the state and local level. One thing that needs to happen, though, is they need to think of the Republican Party of Jefferson and not the Republican Party of Lincoln. There is an old Republican Party, and those people Nathaniel Macon, Thomas Jefferson, John Randolph, John Taylor. Those are the good Republicans. So, I mean, if we want to do anything, save the Republican Party, the name, from itself and say, well, look, we're the old Republicans. We're not the party of Lincoln. We're the party of Jefferson. We're the old Republicans. As they called themselves that back in the early 19th century. So I think that's what should happen. We can call ourselves Republicans. You know, the party of Lincoln stole the name. That's really what happened more than anything else. Lincoln, his party stole the name from the good Republicans who were there in the party of Jefferson. So it's unfortunate that the grand old party is attached to Lincoln when we should be thinking in terms of Jefferson. With that said, the piece on Tuesday was written by yours truly. It's The Stupid Empire. And I talk about how in 2003 there was as the Republican, I should say, as the U.S. military was invading Iraq, there was a Sergeant, Brad Colbert, of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion of the United States Marine Corps. He leaned out the window of his Humvee and he said, "Vote Republican" to the Iraqi people. But this is indicative of the entire problem we have with the Republican Party. This is why the Republican Party is not what Southerners should be supporting. The Republican Party is imperialistic. It's nationalistic. The old Republican Party of Jefferson was not that way. And so I talk about how all of these things, our current mess, foreign policy mess, goes back to the Republican Party of Lincoln. It was interesting when I was in graduate school. There was a seminar class, and there was an individual there was writing a paper about American foreign policy and the Cretan independence movement right after the war between the states, and how the Republican Party wanted to support this because it was, pushing liberty around the world. And it made perfect sense, but he didn't connect the dots. The paper had some promise, but he didn't connect the dots. He didn't see the Republican Party as this vehicle of imperialism. And it was, whether it was beating up the South, beating up the Indian tribes, moving forward into the Spanish-American War, or looking at Cretan independence. Now, there wasn't a whole lot of support for that, but there were Republicans who wanted to do this. Moving forward into the 20th century, you had Teddy Roosevelt and the Roosevelt Corollary to Monroe Doctrine. You had massive intervention in Latin America. And, of course, ultimately the Democrats picked up on this, too, and went harder than the Republicans ever did. World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Cold War. All of these things are nationalistic, imperialistic ventures that progressivism has brought. And, of course, the progenitor of all of that was Lincoln's Republican Party. And oftentimes they did this under the cover of humanitarianism. It was humanitarian to go and beat up on the South because, of course, we're helping free slaves. Now, whether that was wasn't a war aim in 1861, it became a war aim later, but still, a lot of Republicans didn't support it. There's actually been a really interesting study about this. There's a professor at Christopher Newport University in Virginia who wrote that about, I believe it was this, he wrote about the fact that even the Union veteran vote, the Union soldier vote during the war was skewed a bit because these people could be moved around. They didn't have to vote in a district. They could just be moved around and vote wherever they wanted to. And not just that, there were a lot of, because we didn't have a secret ballot back then, there were a lot of people who didn't vote. And he looked at the fact that the non-voting population was more interesting than the voting population because they didn't want to vote in the election because they would have to vote Democrat then, and so they just didn't. So he looks at the percentages of Union soldiers, and a lot of them still wanted to vote Democrat. But it was perceived at that point, if you vote Democrat, you're supporting the Confederacy, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of this backlash. And this particular professor he was one of Neely's students who wrote a terrible book on suppression of civil liberties in the North. But so he's definitely a Lincolnite. He loves Lincoln. But he's become very sympathetic with the opposition. At least he takes them seriously, the opposition to the Lincoln administration in the North. And that's admirable. He actually wrote a very good book on the ex parte Merriman case. And he really, it's a very short little book, but it's very good in looking at the suspension of habeas corpus and how that was done, and how terrible this actually was. So there are people starting to critically think about these things. Wait a second here. Maybe Lincoln wasn't all that great, or at least there are some cracks in the Lincoln mystique, so to speak. There are cracks in the armor, and we need to take those things seriously. So this is exactly how we should be thinking about foreign policy as well. Once the Republican Party was done beating up on the South, then it had to find other boogeymen to go beat up on, whether it was the Indian tribes out west, whether it was the Spanish during the Spanish-American War, whether it was Latin Americans who were causing problems, and then, of course, all the nationalists, whether, again, Republicans, Democrats, they all started finding boogeymen around the world to go and attack. And this goes right forward into the invasion of the Middle East beginning in 2002. So the war on terror is an open-ended war, just like the Cold War was. And it's perfect for nationalists. It's perfect for the Republican Party. This is what they have always done. It is not in the best interests of the South to support this kind of nonsense, for conservative Southerners to support imperialism. And this is the point of my piece, The Stupid Empire. You have to find people that you're going to elevate, whether it's the black Southerners, whether it's Indians, whether it's Filipino people or Cuban people or Vietnamese people or Korean people or Middle Eastern people, whatever it is. We have to elevate these people, and this is what the Republicans have been doing since 1861. It is not in the best interest of the South to follow this program for a number of reasons. One, it's too expensive. Two, it creates a more powerful central government, which is problematic for the South as a whole. And three, Southerners in larger numbers than anywhere else in the United States go off and fight and die in these wars. So we need to reconsider our foreign policy goals, and the Republican Party is the root of that. Clyde Wilson's piece on Wednesday on allegiances is along the same vein. I mean, he's going after this idea, why is it that we have to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance or stand up for the National Anthem? And what is the point at a sporting contest to have these things? And he brings up William Faulkner, who wrote a piece for Sports Illustrated in January of 1955. And he says this: just what a professional hockey match whose purpose is to make a decent and reasonable profit for its owners had to do with our national anthem. What are we afraid of? Is it our national character of which we are so in doubt, so fearful that it might not hold up in the clutch, that we not only dare not open a professional athletic contest or a beauty pageant or a real estate auction, but we must even use a chamber of commerce race for Miss Sewage disposal or a wildcat land sale to remind us that the liberty gained without honor and sacrifice and held without constant vigilance and undiminished honor and complete willingness to sacrifice at need was not worth having to begin with. So again, what is it? Why do we have to do this? We open every single thing in the United States with the pledge and the national anthem. Clyde goes on to say, Faulkner suggests that the need to blare out the anthem at every occasion reflects a dreamlike state of denial, a cover-up for a loss of the real patriotism and courage of our forebears. In fact, when he passed away in 1962, Faulkner was working on a book to be called The American Dream. What happened to it? That's a good question. And then he goes on to point out the anthem was written by a great Southerner named Francis Scott Key. He points out that Key's grandson supported the Confederacy, which is the part that's really not known. And, of course, if people did know this, and the fact that Key was a Southerner himself, maybe they would have a different perspective on the national anthem. But That I digress. He does point out the national anthem wasn't even the national anthem until 1931. And then, of course, there's the pledge, which is, again, another situation where this was created by a New England socialist to make sure people, supported this one nation, indivisible. As Clyde says, to get immigrants under their control. So what is it that we're doing here by saying you're not a real American unless you say the pledge or the national anthem? What is it? Why are we like this? And it goes back to nationalism. It goes back to the Republican Party. Because the Republican Party was pushing this beginning in the 1860s, this nationalist ideology that has overtaken everything. And right after the war, which is the piece we had on Thursday, you had union leagues, which were set up to violently keep people in line. Now, the union leagues, there's a great book about this actually through Shotwell Press, which is Clyde Wilson's press on the union leagues, and it's you can go on Amazon and find it. I would highly recommend getting that. But John Chodes wrote it. And the fact is these union leagues are not well known. Everyone talks about the Ku Klux Klan or the Red Shirts or the White League, whatever, all these organizations in the South. But what's often not talked about is that there were paramilitary organizations who opposed those groups, and this is one of the reasons why these groups were established. Because you had, through force, the disfranchising of white Southerners, the establishment of military arbitrary rule, and this was highly problematic for the South. And so here is the Republican Party, through force, through the bayonet, enforcing nationalism on the South. Reconstruction is little more than a recreation of America under a nationalist paradigm. And that's what we're getting with the Republican Party. This is why when you vote with the Republicans in 2016, you're getting the exact same nonsense that you had in 1865. Whether it's foreign policy, domestic policy, symbolism, the Pledge of Allegiance, the National Anthem, it doesn't matter. The National Anthem, 1931, of course, this is the Republican-controlled Congress with Herbert Hoover as president. So there's the Republicans for you. So the question has always been, whether Republicans, are they really conservative? What are they conserving? Well, I don't think they were conserving anything. They conserved nothing in 1865. They conserved nothing in 1861. They weren't really conservative. They weren't conservative in the late 19th century. They weren't conservative in foreign policy. They weren't conservative in domestic policy. They had adopted liberal progressivism. They were the party of the left. And they've never really changed. Now, they might speak differently. Well, we support federalism. They're going to give lip service to these things. But when they get in power, they don't ever do it because they don't really believe in it. And that's one thing I will say that's positive about Trump. He's upset these oligarchs. He's upset these people that have controlled the party. The Republican Party, the establishment, are the same Republicans that are around in 1865. They've created this national dynamic to where Lincoln becomes the hero and nationalism becomes the objective. The real root of all of this is not liberalism, it's nationalism. And that nationalism has to be combated. So when you see the piece for Friday, which was written by R.M. Stangler, which the title is Up Maybe from Liberalism, he talks about Richard Weaver, who was a socialist in his youth and then abandoned that. He said not because because he abandoned it, but because it abandoned him. He started looking at the world differently. The cliches of liberalism, as Weaver said, the cliches of liberalism. And so Stangler was a liberal in college, and he's moved away from it because he started realizing that new liberalism is, in many ways, based on the idea that tearing down anything old is right and just. And I would say that in some ways, the conservatives of the Republican Party stripe believe the same exact thing. What are we trying to conserve? What are we trying to conserve? This is what Stengler asked. Which aspects of our tradition and social history, which networks of affection and affiliation did they want to preserve? Did any of them see man, in Weaver's words, as a creature fearfully and wonderfully made and try to lead him with appropriate imagination and subtlety? Did any argue eloquently for working toward the reunion of man into a being who will both know and desire what he knows? So Stengler says history, tradition, social institutions, these things take time to build and effort to maintain. What has alarmed me most as I moved away from liberalism, or as it moved away from me, was how quick my liberal friends were to renounce and reject our delicate social fabric as oppressive, as exclusionary, or as just plain worthless. Churches, schools, communities, not just anachronisms, according to the new liberalism, but dangerous threats to a preference-based culture. This is exactly right. And Stengler says true conservatives, those who care about preserving social institutions, taming capitalism, and laying out a vision of the good and virtuous life, have no political home. We are consigned to the wilderness, trying to focus with Weaver on things which are immeasurably larger and greater than oneself. Again, what he's saying is the Republican Party does not represent true conservatives. It can't, and it never has. And so if there's one thing you can get out of all of these pieces this week, and we've run a lot of things that are similar to this, so the Republican Party is not our savior. The Republican Party will only lead us to more ruin. We have to think outside of that. If we want to talk about a Republican Party, then we need to talk about the old Republicans of Jefferson. We need to go read the book by Norman Risjord, The Old Republicans, because it's excellent. Those are the Republicans worth saving. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's much left in the American polity that will allow that to happen, except on the state and local level. And even then, I'm not certain if Americans are the same as they were when those old Republicans were around. This is going to take time. I don't think there's going to be any political solution to the major problems we're facing. It has to start at the home, and you have to build a culture again, or at least maintain a culture. And that's the only way anything's going to change. You have to be independent. You have to maintain a culture. And politics is a reflection of society. If you look at society today, it's awful. So do the things that you can to change your immediate area first. Yourself, your family, and then start worrying about politics. Because these are the things that we're going to get out of this. The Republican Party has been shown to be worthless in this election cycle, and it's wonderful because it has never really represented real Southerners. It has never really represented real conservatives in America, ever. And I think that's one thing that maybe Trump has done is destroy that idea. And so let's look at a reevaluation of the future and how this works for Southerners. Where do we fit in this? Where do old traditional conservatives fit? Paleo-conservatives, where do they fit? I would say they fit with the old Republicans. But first and foremost, you have to start at home. So I hope you enjoyed this week. Hope you enjoyed the material for this week at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.